Okay, so if you followed everything up to this point, one of the things that you've realized is that our opinions are shaped by the information, and by information I'm talking about the attitudes, by the attitudes we have stored in memory. Again, our opinions, the things that we express, the things that come out of our mouth, things that can be observed, are based on our attitudes. We can observe attitudes, we can observe opinions. And the attitudes, our opinions, are shaped by the information or the attitudes that we have stored in memory. Well, this guy named John Zoller, who I studied with at UCLA, came up with this thing he calls the RAS model that goes ahead and explains what does and does not get stored in memory. Because what gets stored in memory might affect our opinions, but what doesn't get stored isn't going to affect our opinions. And it isn't going to affect our opinions because if it's not stored, it can't be sampled. So let me explain the RAS model, and we'll talk about this in more detail. Again, information can only affect our opinions, the things we express, if it's stored in memory, right? Because when we express our opinion, what do? We take a random sample of the attitudes stored in the top of the head and the back of the head, mostly from the top of the head. We take a random sample of all that, and then based on our sample, that's how we give our response. So information can only affect our opinions if it's stored in memory. Information can only be stored if certain things happen. So first, in order for information to be stored, an individual has to receive and understand the information. They have to receive and understand the information. So for example, where you see it says example 1, if an incredibly interesting and thought-provoking political discussion is happening right now, but it's happening in a Starbucks 8 miles away from your house, is there any way that information is going to affect your opinion? No, there's no way. You're never going to receive that information. You're never going to, encounter that information. It can't possibly affect you if you never receive the information. So that's Zoller's first point. But not just receiving it. You also have to understand it. So for example, if that incredibly interesting conversation is happening and you're sitting in Starbucks, but the conversation is taking place in Hungarian, and I'm assuming you don't understand Hungarian. If it's taking place in Hungarian, you're receiving the information, but you don't understand the information because it's too Hungarian. And so you can't understand the information. If you receive the information but you don't understand it, that's not going to affect your opinions later on. What are you going to store in your head? They're having some incredibly interesting conversation. All you're storing is, I don't know Hungarian, right? So information can only be stored if an individual receives and understands the information. That's what the R in the RAS model stands for, receive. But it should also say it's like receive and understand. You have to receive and understand information. The next part of the RAS model talks about the next step of the process. Once somebody has received some information, they either accept or reject the information, right? They either accept or reject it. So the R means receive, A stands for accept, but it also stands for reject as well. As it turns out, and you probably know this in your own life, when you encounter information that challenges what you believe, are you more likely to accept it or reject it? Because it turns out that individuals tend to accept information that conforms with what they already believe. That's what you should be writing in your notes. Individuals tend to accept information that conforms with what they already believe. Now, if information is accepted, then it gets stored in your memory. And if it gets stored in your memory, it can be sampled later on. So if somebody's talking about the economy and you believe that raising taxes on the wealthy is a good thing, and somebody says, you know, in the past, President Clinton raised taxes on the wealthy and the economy did great, you're going to accept that information. Why? Because it already confirms something you already believe. It's more information, like, oh, that's good ammo. Now I can say that later on when I'm arguing with somebody. So in order for information to go ahead and be available for us to sample it, we have to receive it, we have to understand it, and we have to accept it. And if we do those three things, receive, understand, and accept it, then it's stored in memory. Now, we tend to reject information that challenges our pre-existing beliefs. So if somebody goes ahead and says, oh, well, you know what? So if you're somebody who believes we should raise taxes on the wealthy, and they say, well, you know what? President Reagan lowered taxes on the wealthy, and the economy did great. What happens when you get confronted with something like that? Now it's something you disagree with. People do what we call counter-argue. They start to say, well, that was because of this, and they start to give all the reasons why that isn't a good explanation for what happened. We counter-argue it. We reject that information. Say, I don't accept that as being true. I heard what you said, I don't buy it. So information that's rejected doesn't get stored in memory. And if it doesn't get stored in memory, it can't be sampled later on. It can't be sampled later on. So we have this RAS model. In order for information to have any chance of being in your head, to be sampled when you get asked a question, you have to receive the information, you have to understand the information, and you have to accept the information. If those three things happen, then that information might be at the top of your head or at the back of your head later on if somebody asks you a question that's relevant to that information. So the S, so the R is receive, the A is accept, but it also means accept and reject, and then the S in the RAS model is this idea of sampling. And that's the memory-based model. That when people are asked survey questions, they take a random sample of the attitudes they have stored in memory. They oversample what's at the top of the head. They undersample what's at the back of the head. In other words, most of the attitudes that they sample are going to be right what's at the top of the head. And they base the opinions that they express on those things. That's what the RAS model talks about. Why do certain people have some information at the top of the head and other people don't? What kind of information do we accept and do we reject? And the bottom line is people tend to accept information that confirms what they already believe, and they tend to reject information that challenges what they believe. We all do it, so don't feel guilty.